The desk lamp clicks on, and suddenly the chaos stops being decorative. That same messy board of notes and red string becomes legible only when we force it into evidence cards instead of folklore. We start by naming the claim as it is stated, not as it sounds. If a story says the witness saw a figure, we treat figure as a variable and ask what document first used those words. Then we separate primary records from secondary summaries. Primary records are contemporaneous documents, official logs, sworn testimony, anything created close to the event by people with direct access or mandated duties. Secondary summaries are everything that comes later: books, documentaries, oral retellings, especially when they compress multiple dates into one convenient line. Next, we map each claim onto a source date chain. We do this claim by claim. What source first reported it? What later source echoes it? And whether the later version can be traced back instead of merely repeated. When a statement has no primary reference we can point to, we flag it as unverified. Not false, not true, just unanchored. If the dates don't line up, we treat that as an anomaly, not a mystery-shaped shrug. A timeline conflict might look like this: a sworn statement dated after the supposed incident, or a log entry that places an event before the arrival time recorded elsewhere. Sometimes the contradiction is subtle, like a translation discrepancy that shifts night into early morning. Sometimes the gap is blunt, a missing page, a ledger that ends mid-month, a sudden silence in records right when the story wants momentum. And when we find a claim that survives those checks, we know why it matters. It earns attention because it has a traceable route through the paperwork. Now that we can read a mystery as evidence, we need to decide what happens when a record goes missing, because the most stubborn gaps rarely announce themselves. If you've heard the Dyatlov Pass story in its most popular form, you probably heard a sequence that feels tidy. Who first set the movement in motion? Why the injuries must have come from one specific cause? And how the cold supposedly forces a single chain of decisions. Our case file doesn't read like that. It reads like several competing reconstructions, written in different moments, with different emphases, and later retellings stitching them into one continuous certainty. Take the early trigger claim. Later summaries often describe one clear starter, some single person, or a single decision that cascaded immediately. But contemporaneous investigation notes and subsequent reconstructions do not converge on one initiating actor in the way the legend implies. Different authors track different starting points through the same limited physical observations, and the internal logic shifts depending on which reports they treat as most decisive. Now, consider the injury narrative. Popular versions tend to attach certain injuries to a specific mechanism, as if the body count itself points to one explanation. Yet the record contains enough ambiguity in timing and assessment that multiple cause and effect chains remain plausible. Some injuries are interpreted one way in later accounts. Other interpretations are either absent or grounded differently in the earlier material. When we place these discrepancies on one timeline sheet, the overlaps become obvious. Several arrows point from the same observed facts, but they land in different orders. Different ink colors cross out one another as directions. That is not a minor editorial slip. It is evidence of compression. Uncertainties from different stages of reporting are being folded into a single, easy-to-repeat storyline. So here is the challenge. Are you watching a record of what was established, or are you inheriting a legend that smooths out contested links? Next, we examine what the site conditions actually constrained, because the ground truth is harder to sequence than the retelling suggests. 2 on Gilgo Beach. The popular retelling often behaves like a straight road. A sighting happens at the mouth of the river. It's reported. Investigators find the bodies in a matching location, and the chain snaps into place. But when we treat the case like a file paper against paper, the geography doesn't align as neatly as the legend suggests. Picture a small map on a desk, with sticky notes marking where someone believes the critical moment occurred. One team pins the mouth of the river reference slightly landward. Another pins it nearer the surf line. On the surface, the difference is only a few yards. In records, that difference can matter, because it changes what later accounts can responsibly claim as nearby at the same time, or consistent with the earlier description. Now imagine a brief, live vignette. A witness thinks they saw something moving close to the waterline, and they tell an agency soon after. In the retelling, that becomes a clean, initiating event, one timestamp, one place, one logical lead. Yet record review shows discrepancies in how certain sightings were documented. Not only the reporting times, but the context attached to those times, sometimes changing in later updates or being framed differently depending on which agency S-log is used as the anchor. We can't simply harmonize those differences by wishful thinking. The missing piece is often not the existence of reports, but the consistency of their framing. Which log gets treated as primary for when and where is contested. And some summaries compress uncertainties from earlier stages into a single certainty that the original documentation does not fully support. This is the contradiction at the heart of the "it must have happened this way" certainty. The case can be made to fit, but only by harmonizing conflicting entries rather than relying on one definitive account that already contains all the links in sequence. And that means the next question isn't just who said what, or when they said it. It's what the site itself could realistically allow, because environment sets constraints, and those constraints can expose the gaps that retellings quietly smooth over. In the Summer Demand case, the claim that one more link would solve it sounds reasonable until we open the file and treat the evidence like a chain of parts that must connect end to end. The unresolved status isn't just mystery fog. It's a structural mismatch between three things that should converge: the origin of the unusual fabric and trace elements, the meaning of the coded strip claims attributed to him, and the corroboration offered for proposed identifications. Here, the apparent contradiction. Several researchers can build a compelling explanation for one segment at a time. One theory anchors itself in the material traces and suggests a particular origin pathway. Another leans hard on how the coding is interpreted, claiming it points to a known text, publisher, or method. A third concentrates on identification candidates and argues for plausibility through biographical fit. Each proposal can look complete inside its own box, but the convergence fails when we return to primary documentation and demand the same evidentiary trail to support all segments together. The fabric and trace elements often lack a consistently documented origin chain that would also validate the coding interpretation. The coded strip claims, meanwhile, are contested in how they were derived, transmitted, or later described in summaries, and the proposed identifications, even when they seem to match certain facts, do not reliably corroborate the same set of material and interpretive links in the contemporaneous record. It's like a puzzle box where the pieces match the right shapes, yet the picture never continues across the missing edge. Three nearly matching answers each stop at a different cliff because the bridging documentation either isn't present, isn't stable across logs, or can't be verified from the same source base. So the question shifts from why didn't they find him to which portion of the story is supported by the same chain of evidence, and which portion only survives by borrowing certainty from elsewhere. That distinction guides the next step. We have to examine what the record allows us to treat as continuous and what it forces us to treat as permanently broken. When people describe the Zodiac cipher, they often describe a promise, a cipher that cannot reveal no one could know outcomes. That premise sounds airtight because it treats the code as a closed system with fixed constraints. But a careful comparison of Zodiac-related texts shows that the outcome depends on how the material is handled before any decryption attempt begins. Across authenticated messages, the formatting choices are not decorative. Spacing, line breaks, punctuation, and repeated blocks determine where analysts draw boundaries. One analyst treats a cluster as one continuous cipher. Another analyst cuts it into segments, then assigns different solving rules to each segment. A third treats the repeated elements as a key indicator and then projects a complete plaintext solution from that partial correspondence. The discrepancy is not in the enthusiasm. It is in the interpretive scaffolding. This is where the no one could know dead-end forms. Many popular breaks assume that the cipher text itself forces a single decoding pathway. They then use that pathway to justify an identity claim. Yet the analytic constraints do not stay consistent when you compare claims across communications. The same approach that makes one segment look solvable depends on selective assumptions about what counts as part of the cipher, what counts as a delimiter, and what counts as intentional repetition. We can see the pattern shift most clearly when claimed solutions require formatting decisions that are not applied uniformly across all authenticated messages. If a solution requires one way of grouping characters, it becomes vulnerable whenever the grouping method changes. If a candidate plaintext depends on a repeated pattern being meaningful, it collapses when similar repetitions are treated as noise in other messages. The evidence chain becomes conditional rather than verifiable. It helps to picture a lock with several tumblers that turn smoothly for a while, then jam. Early turns can create the illusion of progress, even when the lock does not share the same mechanical story all the way through. In the Zodiac case, partial fits exist, but the full identity claim remains unanchored by an unambiguous, consistently verifiable decryption pathway. The credible takeaway is constrained and durable. Parts may be solvable, but the comprehensive "this proves the whole person" claim depends on bridging assumptions that do not survive a strict cross-text comparison. From there, the case file demands a different kind of scrutiny, one that tests what survives when interpretation is held to the same standard for every authenticated message. By the end, we move past the instinctive spooky myth framing. We don't ask which story is scarier. We ask what records actually support the claim. Each mystery becomes a record problem. We separate evidence from embellishment, flag the exact gaps where corroboration breaks, where dates or methods disagree, and state the most credible hypotheses that still survive cross-text comparison. What once felt unknowable turns into a disciplined summary of what can be responsibly inferred. If you want more of these case file breakdowns, hit like, subscribe, and drop the next mystery you want audited.